Part 2. Here we are reminded to breathe in, again, always animating, reanimating, reactivating the image of the body, the breath of the lungs, the anima, life breath, but also the breath of the heart. In this, we are a disciple to the image. Just as communion is based on to be atoned one, also communion as sacrifice, say prayer, disciple is based on discipline. We have a discipline in this process, a discipline and a dedication to the image. Images as the wealth of the soul, images as half of the world existing in images, this imaginal knowing and research. So we have here this beautiful image of Jung prostrate before this volcanic, fiery, incandescent matter with these yod-like figures, again, remembering that the archetypal aspect of the image is not just the personifying figures, whether it's Izdubar's Gilgamesh, Salome, Elijah, etc., but in the imagery itself. So you have the stylized aspects from totemic design. Again, I live in the Pacific Northwest, so this is something that you see in this area, but it is archetypal, so it's emergent from the unconscious and the images of the unconscious. You have, of course, the great sun disk and that barge-like image crossing the waters of the image itself. A disciple to the image. As a disciple to the image, we are a disciple to the soul who speaks in images. This is our dedication. And again, Jung's soul said it's a new proclamation of a new religion. In this, we are a disciple, not of Christ, but of the image of the soul who speaks in images. And so we set out almost as pilgrims on this painted path, disciples to the images that allow us to follow the soul like breadcrumbs. Images that are, again, this act of embodiment. Not for no reason, Jung said, is it a great work of art, alchemy, and it's also a body of art. Just as we embody the soul in our body, betrachten, living our animal, based on the Latin root anima, we are embodying the soul in art. This is the beauty of art. The soul is not bound by space and time, is known as an intelligence through materialization in the Zofinga lectures, Jung said, italicizing materialization. This is a form of embodiment that reanimates the image to include, and perhaps most specifically, the word, beginning with these different quotes about embodiment, the embodied word. First there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So the Red Book begins with Elijah, and begins with John 1:14, this embodied reimagining of the Logos, the Word of Christ. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Words are animals alive with a will of their own, it says elsewhere in the Red Book. Words lift up the underworld, they bring up the underworld, this animated animality of the word itself. And of course here we have this wonderful depiction of the illuminated manuscript style, but made so much his own, as we all are to make this process, archetypally speaking, our own. And look at the beauty, these red and blue veins, in a sense, that come together in these dendrite-like hands. The animation with nature itself, and the red eye a la Sauron, again remembering that, like Rebecca Tarnas elaborates, the Red Book of Tolkien, concurrent with the Red Book of Jung. Similarly, Rilke was doing work, this animation and reclaiming of the word. Here we have the word become flesh, and The St. John's Bible, this is the most recently commissioned large-scale illuminated manuscript. And again, to give you a sense of the magnitude of these efforts, this was a full-scale team. Beautiful if you've not looked at it. Most libraries have a copy, as they have a copy of the Red Book. There are documentaries on the creation of St. John's Bible. I have a number of different books on it. But this gives you a sense of the diversity. These two are from it. The 7 days of creation. Look at this radical divergence. If we are made in the image of God, in the image of Christ, in the image of the Bible itself, what does it do, for example, to have pictures, not just in children's illuminated, illustrated Bibles, but to have pictures, to have the pictographic, the cartographic representation be primary. What does that do in terms of activating our imagination? If this is creation, these are the 7 days of creation, how does that reframe the image of we were made in the image of the Creator? Adam and Eve, most explicitly in the St. John's Bible, are tribal people as they were. As we know through genetics. We have this primordial ancestral genetic Eve in Africa. There is a radical divergence in terms of the handling of the image in this text which is visual and verbal, paintings which are visual and verbal, all of which is an art. So we have the Word became flesh, and this beautiful depiction of this almost incandescent alchemical gold, this irradiating and radiant image of Christ. Here we have Salvador Dali, an illumination from an illuminated manuscript that he created. And I honestly didn't even know that he had created one until I was on a Rhine River cruise, in which I was going primarily to see all of these beautiful cathedrals, which had pagan iconography, which in a sense, I was primarily in the Netherlands, and so a lot of UNESCO World Heritage sites, because the wealth and the affluence of those cities allowed that region to never be destroyed. Only one city was destroyed. So you had this bridge, if you will, this path from present to past through the ages, so you could see the evolution of the iconography. You walked under these very pagan, almost tribal depictions of animals, myriad animals, almost shamanistic animal-human hybrids, wild men, so you'd have these cathedrals that would have this span of time present within them. And unbeknownst to me, they had illuminated manuscripts in their crypts and catacombs underneath, along with the relics of the dead, in this most ancient part of all of the cathedrals, that which was chthonic, that went underground. Besides that, I ended up, a la this image, being told by the tour guide to meet at this town square, on the corner of which was a Dali museum with over 300 original Dali images, very idiosyncratic. Dali, a surrealist painter who did not do drugs. He famously said, "I do not do drugs, I am drugs." And yet when I went in and I walked around and toured this exhibit, at the end of which was the illuminated manuscript, they were this loose handling of watercolor, very deep depths of shadow content, sexuality, mortality, morbidity, violence, just deep shadow content. So whether he came to it through entheogens, apparently not, given his statement. I know that he hung out with some people who did do that. But whatever the reason, however he got to these images, they were very much the shadow content. Usually Dali has images of his wife Gala with a pomegranate, or the Christ crucifixion, Last Supper, a lot of religious content, but handled with this perfect detail, this really technical ability that was profound. And yet all of this art was this very different representation, to include an illuminated manuscript. So that difference in the handling of the image and the archetypal form of an illuminated manuscript. More of the master painters approach this work than you might imagine, than certainly I had imagined in my naivete. So synchronicity led me to over 12 illuminated manuscripts in these crypts and catacombs, of which the entirety of these cathedrals, remembering Jung said the Red Book was a cathedral, a church to return to for renewal. These cathedrals in which everything was a work of art. Everything was a work of art, sacred made through sacrifice, and culminating with this treasure trove of Dali images. All of which in my circuitous path, that literally was a circuitous path, that Rhine River cruise actually, brought me to this sense of atonement. What is this painted path that we're walking in this process? This circuitous circumambulation of the image. The image is us, again, we are the art, we are walking this painted pathway through our experiences mirrored in the art. So when I walked on these cobblestones on this cruise, on which I was obviously dropped on land, hence the cobblestones, I am walking this painted path. It weaves in our life's experience. Dreams, Robert Bosniak said there are only 2 to 3 dreams in the Red Book, primarily active imagination. But it's this weaving together of inner and outer reality through images, weaving together of opposites. Words and images, or what are typically thought of as the word image problem. This is the reconciliation of those transcendent function of the opposites, the tension of the opposites, atoned within us, within art, through the mediation of the soul, whose nature is this mediation. I bind above and below God and animal in a third part human. This is this soul's iconography. Again, the power of the iconoclasm of prohibiting graven images was that it severed this path, this individuation journey that is evolution and creation. This path is a path of atonement. For me, it circumambulated back to the original image of Eden in the Western tradition, the garden, nature. And so we return. And as we know from Meredith Sabini's work on nature and Jung, the earth has a soul. Jung had this very animistic, animated relationship to the earth as ensouled. Again, we are born of the mater, mother, matter, the realm of the mothers. Matter matters, if you will. We are born of that substance. Again, remembering in Eden, Adam means red clay, Eve, life breath, and evening, that transition between day and night. Archetypally speaking, in mythologies across the world and across spanning space and time, the enlivening of the animated material through the life breath, through the soul, that is the image into which we step in this recreation, reformation, eternal mind's reformation, as Goethe said, of the image. This is the turning of the zodiacal wheel that evolves us, that turns the wheel of our own evolution of the soul. And in it, we return to nature. This is the most critical piece of my own direct experience. We can see it in Jung. Jung spoke so intimately and effectively, but also effectually, with affect, with affection about nature, this return to nature within as on the animal path as the initiates of old. Some quotes from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in which nature wove throughout. The will of the Creator is nature. Nature is, of course, a reflection of God, made in the image of the Creator, creation and Creator, a theme Jung weaves throughout his writing that is definitely something that we are weaving in our own process. Archetypes and dreams are pure nature. We are nature. To be natural, to be in balance with the natural world, which again I'm going to suggest in the spirit of the times is a radical imperative in terms of the kairos of our moment. We are in the sixth phase of extinction, in which mammals go first. Again, we tend to forget that we are indeed mammals. We have an ecological imperative as well as an imperative of soul loss, if you will, to follow this path in return to nature. We are, in effect, leaving the church of the Father. And here I return to that communion experience Jung had with his father. And he had expectations for it. This sacramental ritual of the body and the blood. He had, as you remember, been fascinated and in a way fearful of the communion in the Catholic rite, the church fathers, the priests, this ancient archetypal ritual. And yet when he experienced it, he said he felt that God was absent, union with ... and absence of union. Again, I'm suggesting, as I'm sure has been suggested by many, that this is a replacement. This church, this cathedral is rebuilt from Jung's visions of his childhood, his experience of his childhood, his leaving of the church. After this failed First Communion, Jung left the church and did not take communion there again, or at least so it seems from the writing. And so returning to the Red Book, a place to return to again and again for renewal, he is returning to the anima as the altar itself, and that will be in the next slide. And the altar is where we have communion. This is a communion with the soul, just as he found the red stone at the end of rebuilding, returning to his childlike building on the lakeshore. In initiating the turning point, he said, that initiated the floodgate of images, this return to the numinous creative capacity of his childhood, building a church out of stones, the last piece of which was this red synchronous stone he found, reminiscent of the Red Book, of the red jewel in the Red Book, of the blood. Eros is red, he said. All of this tied in with this altar. This is a new church, a new cathedral, a cathedral of the soul, animated and embodied, enlivened by art. And so we return, because all of this is a new old way, a new old path. Jung's statement that he felt a barbarian compared to the soul without a future or a past. The soul is this continuity of time and space, unbound but connecting through this pathway. So we return to a new and yet old way, a circumambulation. As Jung said in the Cornwall seminar, perhaps the time has come to bring the spirit as that has been gained back to the animal life, and he called it the animal community meal, the sacrificial ritual of communion, back. Not living a literal Dionysian reenactment, but this animation of the image. So I suggest we return perhaps most precisely to this image. Again, in the footnote, Jung is speaking of a dream, as Sham Dasani writes, then she, the anima, appears in a church. Again, this is a rebuilding, a new proclamation of a new religion. It is the rebuilding, the reconsecration of a church and a cathedral of the soul and her iconography. She appears in the church taking the place of the altar, not as an icon, but as the altar itself. And here I want to segue into a personal moment. I went on a journey up with my mother and found an altar. And it was a symbolic act. I had been reading about altars. But in this process, I had a number of different synchronous death and rebirth experiences. I saw all these pictographs and sacred art that was very ancient, that led into it. But essentially the gestalt of the experience was I remembered how central death is to the altar. Death The relics of the dead were held in the altar. The altar was placed over the crypts and the catacombs as I went in these cathedral experiences on the Rhine River. It is almost to enter into death, to go under. And you descend often by the altar, going underneath. The effigies of the knights, as Jung had in that archetypal moment from which he said archetypal theory came from, or at least his theory of archetypes, of the living dead, the dead that are still living. The communion, the death, the dead body and blood are placed on the altar. The centrality of death is something that I think we need to awaken to and to remember, this dismembered body of Christ and all these communion wafers. We are reclaiming the projection of that back into our body. That is, in effect, what communion is. And in my experience with the altar, I felt I had that. So that's my way of saying these images, the altar, Jung's painting as an image, can of course be animated by our own experience. There's only one way, and it's your way. And it's not just this literal start to finish of now I'm going to dedicate myself as a disciple to the image in this process. I realized that I was preparing in pilgrimage in different ways, like the Rhine River cruise, like this altar experience. I'm weaving in these synchronous threads as I move along, those salient moments that contribute to this path. In this process, I am illuminating the darkness. One of the ways to imagine this is a genre based on illumination, of course, an illuminated manuscript. We are enlightened in this process. It's named after the reflected light of the illumination on gold, on silver, archetypally of the gold, the masculine, the sun, silver, the moon. But the symbol of gold, again, transmuting lead into gold, is the conjunctio, the circumpunct of the circle with a point at the center of the masculine and the feminine together. You can see this, of course, in all different ways. It can be a path where you bring your little illuminating consciousness, this light that we bring into the darkness. And it is not our darkness, it's collective darkness. It can be like entering into the crypts and the catacombs, which are dark, which are damp, which are very much of the earth. We are entering into our own body, entering into the body of art, entering into the cavernous realm of the mothers, going 1,000 feet deep and even deeper to the magma, to the levels of the earth that are active and enlivened and engaged. This is an illumination of the darkness. However you hold it for you. To include for me, there was very much a recurring image of the numinous beauty of the night sky. I have a hot tub in which I was aptly in water, warm water, which was nice, under the night sky, and I try and get in it every night. And I feel like in a way I am mediating above and below. And I am able to enter, in a sense, into this realm that is the above, that is its own cosmic ocean with points of light. So however you imagine this darkness illuminating this path of illumination, the enlightening thought of the body, my path is light, it is said in the Red Book. This path that we walk with darkness and light. Again, we can see it in art, the chiaroscuro of the dark and the light. This is this central contrast that we are reconciling in the transcendent function. Held in so many ways. God of fire, God of growth. This is a vegetative God like Osiris, this God of the underworld, of the earth itself, Pan, Dionysus, this revelry, the goddess. Very much Jung's statement that in the past men worshipped the goddess and essentially did not like that, repressing that into the earth, and that he threw all of this, he said, into his anima. We are very much resurrecting, digging in this archaeological dig down into the layers of the earth to reform, to remember matter as mother, this vegetative aspect. And of course that takes so many forms. In the Red Book, it is a sprout, it is a seed. In the Cornwall seminar, that language is reiterated. It is definitely a tree, the tree of life connecting above and below. The tree, again, whose roots have to reach down into hell on earth. Hell, remembering that the left-hand pillar of the tree of life itself in the Kabbalistic tradition in Gematria is 666, the sacred number of the beast, the demonized feminine, connecting the roots in return to the garden to allow us to reach up into the heavens with the branches that reach perhaps to the stars themselves. This bridging of fire and water, of earth and air, of the four elements, the four directions. Again, that is a part of the square of the altar, this quaternio. I bind above, with the below I bind God and animal. In Betrachten, Jung used the word to look at and to activate, to make pregnant, from animal husbandry in German. I do not speak German, so I'm not going to have an in-depth elaboration of the nuance of the language, but that in and of itself is enough, I think. We're activating our body. Jung spoke again and again of the multisensory capacity of this, the activation of our body in which it stirs, it comes to life. Remember, Jung could not paint what was soulless. He could not soullessly copy what was external to him. He was a natural visionary artist, painting what was activated, stirred by his imagination. And he said the stirring, you couldn't control it. Once you were animated and brought to life, it had a life of its own. Elijah's statement, we are not symbols, no more than you, we are alive as you are. This animation in all of the animated senses. And that's part of what I'm trying to get at with this capacity of the website, to be able to speak to you, in which you can see me move. You can see that I am a human. We have a reciprocity in terms of the image, born, created in the image. I want this to come to life to the extent that it can. So when you animate your body with your breath, for me, I feel that on my tongue. I'm aware of the wet and the dry of my mouth, the movement of my hands, the air as it enters further into my body, the feel of my feet as they touch the earth, this embodiment. These are not empty words. Words are not empty. We're claiming the embodied aspect, as we started with, of the Logos, the living word made flesh that dwelt among us. Let it be so. And we're moving to this return. Here we have words, and we have images, words as images, and we have this scarab-like depiction, the carapace of the beetle. Beetles are one of the first things to go in climate change in terms of the ecological imperative of our time, the dung beetle, this sacred animal. In a class I took in college 30 years ago, I had a class on the wilderness. I, of course, chose to look at it as a metaphor of wandering in the desert. Everyone else took it as the literal image of the wilderness, to be in it. But a very important question was raised, and we pondered it over and over. If we do not have the outer correspondent, the living beetle, the living polar bear, the living tiger, the living tree, what does that do to the inner image? How are we degraded, eros, degraded, as Jung said in the Red Book in the appendices? This is a representation of something. What if that something doesn't exist in the external sense? There's no answer, but something to hold and to ponder as we create these images. In a way, we can even be seen as salvage anthropologists, recreating the iconography of the past to hopefully build a bridge to a present and a future in that image, so that that image still exists. And of course, Jung found himself in the desert worshiping a beetle in the Red Book, worshiping an animal. So something taken up by James Hillman in archetypal psychology, something I definitely am taking up in the website, living your animal. There is a reason that that was the one lament, the one thing the dead forgot to do was live their animal, the sin of Christ, the lament of the daemons. The gods were made manifest through our living our animal. The gateway to the gods was through our body. Numberless gods, more gods than men, were made manifest through this act. It's implied in the 7 Sermons of the Dead. This is important. And in fact, this love and serving of the dead is the new commandment. None of the old commandments are abrogated or negated. Don't kill anyone. We are still on the righteous path. And yet, this path descends into the depths. Just as Persephone descended, and Clarissa Pinkola Estes has an earlier archetypal path and narration of Persephone in which she willingly descends. And in this act of salvation that you can see archetypally reiterated in different figures, Osiris dismembered, remembered by Isis, so much of this imagery from that. Christ descends into hell, this descent into hell in salvation, saving the dead. This is the archetypal movement that we're going to. How specifically are we doing that? We are living our animal, reclaiming this animated image, all of our senses. I took a class on bringing breath and voice in my body from this renowned operatic singer. And I ended up realizing that I lived like a little tiny top hat on the top of my body. And so from that point, I've been in this process of bringing myself, animating, living my animal into my body. That to me is part of what Jung is saying here. How do you become embodied? There are, again, a million paths. All paths lead to the center. Find your way. This embodied art, in which Jung did yoga, which is another path, and an adjunct I'm suggesting to this path, to regulate his energy. Find your path. In service to the dead, these archetypal living dead, who are also us, to the extent we are not alive in this moment. This is the resurrection, the animation, the remembering of the dead in the image, walking this path. And so we move into part 3.